Hello, my friend. Welcome to your sleep story. My name is Stephen Dalton. I'm an Irish storyteller, and it's my great privilege to be the voice that you listen to as you go to sleep tonight. Tonight I continue my incredibly dull history series. As you might have got by now, it's not always incredibly dull, and sometimes I like to add a little humor in as well, so I apologize in advance if you find yourself laughing as you go to sleep. Tonight we visit America. A lot of you are from there, I know, and so I thought I'd make this story about the history of transportation in your country. From the Oregon Trail to private jets, we'll cover the full spectrum of how people have crossed this amazing country over many years. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Okay, let's do the relaxation session now, which will take a few minutes before tonight's sleep story. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1, and as I do, allow yourself to let go more and more. 10. Feel the support of the bed beneath you, or the floor, or whatever surface you lie on tonight. And beneath all of that, feel the support of the earth. That deep, grounding support, that constant support, that unchanging, reassuring support that comes from our home, the earth. And as you become aware of it, see if you can release a little more. Let go a little more. 9. Feel into your body now. Where are you still holding? Where do you feel tension? Perhaps you feel pain. Maybe it's in your toes or your feet. Maybe it's in your lower legs. Maybe your thighs or your belly. Maybe you're holding in your chest. Or maybe you're like me and you hold too much tension in your hands or your face. And as you lie here now, and as you become aware of this tension or holding on, notice the release that comes with awareness. Just let go now. 8. You are safe. Allow my voice to be a friend tonight, to be a gentle guide. Know that my voice will only ever take you to safe places. See if you can find the peace in that fact. See if you can find the trust. See if you can notice that when we feel safe, we can become curious, and we can feel a little light of joy within our hearts as we move closer and closer to sleep. 7. The day is done. Whatever has been, and whatever will be, will be. Whatever thoughts arrive with you tonight, just notice them for what they are. Thoughts, a part of being human, but not you. You are not your thoughts. You don't have to follow them. They don't have to lead your emotions. And so if and when they come, and they will, let them float away now, like leaves on a moonlit river, or clouds passing by through a starlit sky. 6. This is your moment. This is your time. Allow that fact to enable you to settle in now, to feel cozy now, to feel the warmth and joy of the ability to just lie here and hear a cozy story. 5. Peace lives within you. It is always there. It is just waiting to be found, waiting to be felt. And so see if you can find that peace within you tonight. 4. Perhaps allow a little gratitude now. Gratitude for the simple things. The shelter you have tonight. The breath in your body. 3. Begin to engage with your imagination now. Begin to see the land of America. Long before the European settlers arrived, first we are visiting a time when people traveled by foot and by canoe. A simpler time, far away from all that you know. 2. Checking in with your body one more time now. Your body has worked hard for you today. It's time to give it rest. and one. Completely letting go now as I tell you tonight's sleep story. Part 1, in which the first people already knew where they were going. Before there were wagons, before there were horses, before anyone had ever uttered the phrase, "Does this thing take regular or unleaded?" people were already moving around what would someday be called America with quiet competence. The original inhabitants of this land, the many native peoples and nations, did not wait for the invention of the wheel to go visiting. They walked, they paddled, they traveled with intention, and, one imagines, with at least the occasional mild complaint about the weather. They moved through forests and across plains on well-worn paths that had been passed down not through signage or permits, but through memory, experience, and an entirely reasonable desire to reach places where there might be fish, berries, or cousins. There were no traffic lights. There were no toll booths. There were, from time to time, mosquitoes, but these were handled with the same stoic grace that would later be required on the New Jersey Turnpike. Travel was a part of life, and not yet something that involved waiting for your father to tie a canoe to the top of the car with string that was definitely strong enough. Canoes, by the way, were excellent. Light, fast, and capable of carrying people, goods, dogs, and probably the occasional grumpy child who didn't want to go to the summer village again. In the Great Lakes region, people glided across vast waters with no fuel, no noise, and no cup holders. The modern kayak has yet to recover from the comparison. In short, when European settlers arrived with wagons that regularly broke down 3 miles from anywhere, and horses that mostly just looked tired, the land's original residents had already mastered the art of getting from A to B without a fuss. They had the roots, the rhythm, and the good sense not to overcomplicate things. It is therefore historically accurate to say that American transportation begins not with the wheel, but with walking, competent, quiet, possibly barefoot walking, often toward somewhere that already had a perfectly good fire going, and something decent for supper. Part 2, in which horses arrive and immediately cause a bit of a stir. It is a little-known fact that the horse is not originally from America. Horses had once roamed the continent, long before people did. But by the time humans were making fires and singing songs under the stars, the horses had vanished, possibly out of sheer anticipation for their dramatic return several thousand years later. That return happened courtesy of the Spanish, who brought horses with them in ships, which, if you've ever tried to get a horse onto a boat, is a logical miracle in itself. The horses were not consulted. They disembarked in the 16th century, looked around, and promptly wandered off into the landscape, possibly in search of something quieter. Over time, horses spread north and east across the continent, and indigenous peoples, being observant, practical, and generally quite good at making the most of a situation, took notice. Here was an animal that could carry you, your belongings, and possibly a slightly moody teenager all at once. They could go faster than walking, could be taught not to step on your foot, and in certain situations might even look majestic. So by the 18th century, many plains nations had adopted the horse into daily life with such elegance and efficiency that European observers assumed they'd always had them. Horses transformed travel, trade, and hunting, and became a part of culture and story, although even the most sacred stories probably left room for the fact that sometimes horses just don't feel like cooperating. Because for all their beauty and usefulness, horses do come with opinions. Some of them don't care for saddles. Some of them don't care for people. Some of them object very specifically to the color red, the sound of snapping twigs, or a leaf that wasn't there yesterday. But indigenous riders, particularly on the plains, became masters of horsemanship, riding bareback, guiding with knees, and knowing precisely how to talk a horse out of its bad mood with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. And so, by the time the colonial wagons began creaking across the landscape pulled by horses who had clearly drawn the short straw. Indigenous nations were already conducting horse-powered journeys that were faster, quieter, and significantly less prone to losing a wheel in the mud. Part 3, in which Europeans attempt to invent transportation, mostly by accident. By the early 1600s, European colonists had begun arriving in earnest. English in the east, French in the north, Spanish in the south, each armed with big dreams, modest tools, and very little understanding of how large North America actually was. Their concept of transportation was borrowed wholesale from home. Roads made of stone, wagons with rigid wheels, horses that didn't mind being shouted at in multiple languages. Unfortunately, the land in America had not read the same manual. It was vast, muddy, forested, and full of rocks, swamps, and opinions. The colonists set about building roads where there were already trails, indigenous trade routes that had worked perfectly well for centuries, and then proceeded to widen them, straighten them, and improve them, which usually meant making them worse. The earliest colonial roads were less like roads and more like a suggestion. A man on horseback might leave Boston in the morning, full of optimism, and reach the next town sometime the following week, provided the bridge was still there, and the bridge keeper was both sober and in the mood. The term post road implied that the mail might eventually arrive, if it didn't fall into a stream or get eaten by a goat. Wagons were the main mode of overland transport, and these came in several varieties, including creaky, top-heavy, and surprisingly flammable. They were made of wood, held together with wooden pegs, and pulled by animals who were doing their best under difficult circumstances. Horses, oxen, and mules were all pressed into service. Oxen were slow but steady. Horses were elegant but fragile. Mules were sensible and deeply suspicious of everyone involved. Journeys were slow. One might set off from Philadelphia in 1752 and reach Lancaster sometime before harvest, assuming no one broke a wheel, lost a wheel, misplaced the entire wagon, or decided to go back and become a cobbler instead. The expression riding shotgun had not yet been coined, but if it had, it would have meant riding slightly tilted while holding onto a wheel that keeps coming off. In some places, toll roads were introduced for a small fee, and by small we mean still slightly resented 250 years later. A traveler could clatter down a wooden plank road and experience the thrill of going 30% faster than usual, while still being overtaken by a cow on foot. Taverns sprang up along these routes every few miles, providing food, shelter, and a place to ask, "Is this still the road?" To be fair, colonial transportation did slowly improve, largely through trial, error, and the loss of many perfectly good shoes to swampy crossings. Ferries were organized. Milestones were installed. The first stagecoaches began appearing by the mid-1700s, offering bumpy rides and regular opportunities to meet strangers in wigs. By the late 18th century, the idea of moving both people and parcels with some degree of reliability was beginning to take root. Still, it was clear that for early colonial America, transportation was not just about getting from one place to another. It was about learning to be okay with not knowing quite where you were or when you might arrive, or why you brought so many cabbages in the first place. Part 4, in which the riverboat momentarily threatens to become interesting, but doesn't. By the early 1800s, a new idea was taking hold across the growing American frontier. What if we stopped trying to drag wagons across hills and instead just floated downhill? After all, America had a great many rivers, and most of them, in a rare moment of cooperation, were headed in the right general direction. Enter the flatboat, a big wooden rectangle with the hydrodynamics of a barn door and the personality of a stubborn barge. It wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't coming back upstream, but it did float, and for many frontier families, that was good enough. So flatboats became a common sight along rivers like the Ohio and the Mississippi, carrying everything from barrels of molasses to crates of chickens, to entire families who had grown tired of walking behind a mule that kept sitting down. Some of these boats were so large they included small cabins, and some were so small they were held together by rope and luck. One particularly optimistic man in Kentucky once floated 600 miles on a flatboat made from parts of a barn he hadn't quite finished building. He arrived in New Orleans with half his cargo intact and all of his complaints thoroughly aired. The trip downstream might take several weeks, depending on the current, the weather, and how many times you stopped to argue about whether that was in fact your barrel floating past. Meals were cooked over small fires in metal pots. Sleep was caught in shifts, often interrupted by the sounds of frogs, insects, and your cousin's accordion. Entertainment, such as it was, consisted of telling stories about the people in the other boats, particularly that one man who always seemed to be steering in circles. Steering, by the way, was done with a very long oar called a sweep, which was essentially a large stick with ambitions. It did not respond quickly. In tight bends, you often had time to shout, "Oh no," and then, "Here we go," and then, "Well, that's the cabbage gone," before the boat made its gentle, creaking acquaintance with the bank. Occasionally, one could spot a keel boat, which was longer, narrower, and more expensive, and therefore instantly less fun. These were often pulled upstream by entire teams of muscular men in damp shirts, who walked the boat forward from the inside, or hauled it from shore, using a long rope and a system of grunts. Mark Twain once wrote about these crews, noting that they were strong fearless and very good at swearing. Eventually, in 1807, a man named Robert Fulton launched something called a steamboat on the Hudson River. This was a large, paddle-powered contraption that coughed smoke, hissed steam, and looked like it might explode at any moment. And sometimes it did. But it was fast, meaning it could travel slightly quicker than the average cow. And it had a whistle, which made up for a great many things. Steamboats soon appeared on the Mississippi and other major rivers, puffing past slower craft with a wheeze of triumph and the faint smell of burnt bacon. They carried people, cotton, whiskey, and more than a few gamblers, and they brought with them the exciting new possibility of traveling both down the river and back up again, an idea that took some getting used to. One gentleman in St. Louis in 1819, upon watching a steamboat return upriver for the first time, is said to have declared, "Well, I'll be. I thought once a man got to New Orleans, he just started over." Despite their growing popularity, steamboats were not without their quirks. Their boilers had a tendency to explode. Their decks were often sticky, for reasons no one cared to explain, and the upper cabins swayed in the wind in a way that made reading difficult and soup dangerous. Still, for many years, they were the most glamorous way to travel westward, provided you didn't mind waking up several hundred miles downstream with no idea who had taken your boots. By mid-century, riverboats had become a fixture of American transportation. Not fast, not always safe, but capable of carrying just about anything that could be boxed, crated, or tied down. Entire towns grew up around river landings. Pilots became minor celebrities, and somewhere out there, the man who floated 600 miles on a barn door was still telling his story, with the number of rescued barrels increasing every year. Part 5, in which people head west in wagons full of pickles, pots, and poor decisions. By the 1830s, a growing number of Americans began experiencing an itch. Not a literal one, although that would come later. after several weeks without a proper bath, but a metaphorical one. They had heard tales of wide open spaces, good farmland, and rivers that practically burst with opportunity, although they rarely came with directions. This itch became a movement. Go west, people said. There's land to be claimed, they added, as though it had no previous occupants. And so, with the confidence of people who had never met a desert, a mountain range, or a truly determined thunderstorm, families began loading up their worldly goods and setting off in wagons that, from the moment they left the driveway, began making ominous noises. The average wagon was a Conestoga style, or prairie schooner, essentially a wooden rectangle with a canvas top, 4 wheels, and the suspension system of a brick. It was supposed to carry about 2,000 pounds, but most families packed closer to 3,000. They brought flour, beans, pots, boots, rope, barrels of lard, and something very fragile wrapped in a blanket that would definitely break in Kansas. One man famously brought a cast-iron stove, which he threw into the river on day 12 and didn't regret for a minute. The journey could take 4 to 6 months, depending on weather, terrain, and how many times someone shouted, "Wait, I left my hat," and turned the entire wagon train around. There were rivers to ford, mountains to cross, buffalo to avoid, and the daily decision of what song to sing while walking beside your oxen, who remained stoically unimpressed. Travel was slow. Most wagons didn't ride in. They walked beside them. Roads were more like vague inclinations. Dust was a given. Rain turned the trail into pudding. Thunderstorms flattened tents. Mosquitoes arrived in biblical quantities. And at night, the wagons were drawn into a big circle, not to ward off danger, as is often claimed, but to stop the oxen from wandering off to pursue a more interesting life. There were guides. Some were useful, some were not. The 1846 Hastings Cutoff, famously advertised as a clever shortcut to California, turned out to be a clever way to get stuck in the mountains with too few supplies and too many regrets. Other guides published helpful pamphlets with such advice as "don't die" and "bring water," both of which were considered optimistic. Meanwhile, if you were in a hurry, say the sort of person who couldn't bear to move slower than a startled tortoise, you might choose the stagecoach. This was a large, leather-slung vehicle, pulled by 4 or 6 horses, operated by a driver with one eye on the road and the other on the condition of the axle. Passengers were crammed inside like slightly dusty sardines, jostled side to side, and allowed one comfort stop every 27 hours, assuming no one had fainted. Stagecoach tickets came with rules. For instance, no spitting inside the cabin, no fighting unless both parties agreed to pause at meal times, no profanity, except in the case of a sudden wheel detachment. Meals were taken at roadside inns, where the food was hot, the coffee was not, and the staff left little to be desired. Beds were available, though few were level, and many came pre-equipped with noises in the walls. Despite all this, the great westward migration persisted. People crossed rivers, prairies, deserts, and mountain passes, leaving behind their homes in Ohio, Virginia, or New York to chase something vague called opportunity. Some found it, others found only wind, but all of them, in one way or another, contributed to the expanding sprawl of American travel, by wagon wheel, by saddle, or simply by stubbornness. Part 6, in which the railroad arrives, and everything gets noisier. In the beginning, American trains didn't go very far, and they didn't go very fast. The first railroads of the 1820s and 30s were modest affairs, short stretches of track laid down between two places that already had perfectly good roads, just to see what would happen. The result was usually a lot of noise, a fair amount of soot, and 1 or 2 people saying things like, "This is progress," while gripping their hat with both hands. By the 1850s, however, things began to gather steam, quite literally. Railroads began to spread like a slow-moving vine across the country. The eastern states saw the rise of elegant railway stations with impressive columns and clocks that mostly worked. Locomotives became larger, heavier, and more confident in their ability to make small children point and shout. It was the dawn of what would become a national obsession. Getting somewhere, not just eventually, but almost on time. And yet, despite the excitement, railroad travel remained delightfully imperfect. Train schedules were more like suggestions. The concept of standardized time hadn't caught on yet. So, 3 p.m. in Albany might be 2:47 in Syracuse, depending on which watch you asked. This led to the invention of railroad time, which was basically actual time. Trains were not quiet. They wheezed, hissed, clanked, shrieked, and belched. Their whistles could be heard across counties, waking babies, alarming cows, and causing poets to reach for metaphor. Inside the carriages, the ride was bumpy, and the heating system enthusiastic in some places, and entirely theoretical in others. Still, it was a marvel. What once took 4 weeks by wagon now took 4 days by rail. And then, in the 1860s, came the great ambition, the Transcontinental Railroad, a bold, complicated, and extremely long plan to connect the east and west coasts by train. It was a feat that would involve mountains, deserts, rivers, embankments, tunnels, pickaxes, contracts, lawsuits, broken shovels, and sandwiches eaten standing up. 2 companies took up the challenge. The Union Pacific, building westward from Omaha, and the Central Pacific, building eastward from Sacramento. They raced toward each other. Workers laid track in all conditions, through snow, wind, sun, and occasional confusion about which way was west. The Central Pacific faced the Sierra Nevada mountains, and quickly discovered that tunneling through granite is not a cheerful activity. The Union Pacific, meanwhile, crossed the flat plains at speed, occasionally pausing to remark, "Is this still Nebraska?" The work was back-breaking and relentless. Thousands of Chinese, Irish, and black laborers did the heaviest of it, digging, blasting, and hammering spikes in silence, while officials gave speeches nearby about American perseverance. At last, in 1869, the two railroads met at Promontory Summit, Utah. A ceremonial golden spike was hammered into place, though not by a workman, but by a man in a hat who had very clean hands. A photograph was taken. Champagne was opened. Speeches were made. And now, America was changed. Suddenly, a person could leave New York on Monday and arrive in San Francisco the following week, tired, dusty, confused about the time, and full of stories about dining cars, ticket inspectors, and the man who spent the whole journey loudly losing at cards. Railroads would go on to define American transportation for decades. Tracks spread like ribs across the country. Towns grew up around depots. Schedules became more precise, and the whistle of a distant locomotive came to symbolize something grand and important, or, at the very least, something that required you to get out of the way immediately. Part 7, in which bicycles, trolleys, and a very nervous automobile appear. By the 1870s and 1880s, America had reached a curious turning point. The trains were humming. The rivers were busy, and the wagons had, for the most part, returned to being flower planters. And yet, in towns and cities across the country, people still had to get from the post office to the bakery without summoning a locomotive. This was the moment for the bicycle. And not just any bicycle. This was the age of the penny farthing, the charming, precarious device with a wheel the size of a barn door in front and something that looked like a stubborn dinner plate in the back. Climbing onto one involved a certain faith in gravity, balance, and the idea that your hat would stay on. The rider sat roughly 6 feet in the air, pedaled like a heron in boots, and hoped that any dismount would be voluntary. These bicycles were not for the faint of heart. They were fast, in the way that something terrifying often is. There were no brakes to speak of. Riders would often leap off rather than attempt a proper stop, and collisions were handled with a gentlemanly "ah," followed by a short flight into a nearby bush. Despite this, the bicycle craze took hold, particularly among young men with excellent posture and little regard for their collarbones. Meanwhile, in the growing cities, another solution was appearing: the trolley. At first, these were pulled by horses, which was just a wagon that had read a book about ambition. But by the 1880s and 90s, trolleys became electric, thanks to the marvels of overhead wires, metal rails, and the deeply unsettling noise of a bell that could be heard 2 zip codes away. Streetcars became a staple of American urban life. They clattered along city streets in a straight line, stopped when someone shouted, and made turning left an act of reckless hope. The interiors were wooden, the seats polished by decades of trousers, and the fare was often 5 cents, exact change, or a very polite argument. At rush hour, or what passed for it, people squeezed in shoulder to shoulder, clutching shopping bags, newspapers, and the occasional chicken in a basket. Conductors walked up and down the aisle with a coin dispenser on their belt, and a face that said, "I've seen everything, and still made it to lunch." Trolleys did not go fast, and they did not go quietly, but they did go, which for most commuters was enough. And then, into this organized chaos came something new, something shiny, something with an engine and no horse at all. The automobile arrived like a cough in church, unexpected, a bit disruptive, and slightly suspicious. Early models had names like the Oldsmobile, or the rears, which may explain why the Ford quickly became more popular. They were open-air, boxy, and sounded like someone attempting to make toast using a lawnmower. Top speed was approximately 20 miles per hour. In small towns, people gathered to watch one sputter past, with comments ranging from to "that'll never catch on." In cities, the reaction was more mixed. Some admired the novelty, while others chased the vehicles with brooms. Horses, naturally, were unimpressed. They expressed their opinions in the usual way, refusing to move, backing into hedges, or staring blankly into the distance until the automobile went away. Early motorists were a special breed. They wore goggles, gloves, and long coats, not for fashion, but to protect themselves from dust, smoke, and the occasional bug at high velocity. There were no traffic lights yet, or lanes, or rules. One man in Chicago was pulled over in 1902 for driving with urgency, which at the time simply meant moving faster than a wheelbarrow. But progress is persistent. By the early 1900s, the automobile was being built in factories. Gasoline was sold in small tins. Windshields were optional. Roads were being paved slowly, unevenly, and often in the wrong direction. The American transportation story, once defined by the creak of wagons and the hiss of steam, now included the low rumble of combustion and the high-pitched swearing of someone who had just tried to crank-start a cold engine. The bicycle remained. The trolley carried on. And the automobile, nervously but steadily, began to take its place. Part 8, in which roads are paved, traffic lights appear, and diners begin serving something called meatloaf. By the 1910s, automobiles had become more than just a passing curiosity. They were now a full-time consideration. Horses, while still common, had begun muttering under their breath. Cities were growing louder. and the American public had collectively decided that if one could travel faster while seated and carrying a thermos, one probably should. There was, however, a problem. Several, in fact. The first was roads, or more accurately, the lack of them. Most roads in America at the time were still unpaved, uneven, and optimistically labeled. A main road might be a gravel path, while a highway might be a stretch of dirt recently cleared of goats. In rural areas, the best roads were the ones people hadn't used recently enough to rattle loose a fender. Enter the Good Roads movement, the quietly determined campaign begun by bicyclists in the late 1800s and gleefully hijacked by motorists once they realized their cars couldn't go 12 minutes without hitting a pothole large enough to lose a picnic basket in it. By the 1920s, government money began to trickle into road construction, which meant that the occasional mile of actual pavement began appearing, often just in time to be admired, driven over, and immediately repaired. As cars increased in number, so too did decisions, mostly about who should go first at intersections. For a while, the answer was whoever arrives most confidently, which led to an era of polite chaos. Eventually, in 1914, the first electric traffic light was installed in Cleveland, Ohio. It had only two colors, red and green. Yellow had not yet been invented, so hesitation had to be done manually. More traffic lights followed, each with slightly different designs, button arrangements, and bulb wattage philosophies. Some flashed, some blinked, but eventually they settled into the system we know today. Green means go. Red means stop. Yellow means either hurry up or slow down, depending on how long you've been driving. Then came the signs. The American landscape began to sprout metal rectangles and circles, declaring things like slow, yield, and bridge out, often placed helpfully after the danger. The stop sign, now iconic in its 8-sided glory, was originally yellow, then white, then eventually red, partly for visibility, and partly because red paint was finally durable enough to withstand both sun and sarcasm. With roads improving and signs shouting friendly instructions, the next inevitable development was roadside food. The first true diners emerged in the 1920s and 30s. Long, low buildings, shaped like train cars, often made of gleaming metal and tiled floors. You could mop with one hand while flipping pancakes with the other. They served coffee, pie, pancakes, and a peculiar regional concept called meatloaf, which could be made from any combination of beef, breadcrumbs, sincerity, and guesswork. Menus were laminated, counters had spinning stools, waitresses wore small hats and poured coffee with the confidence of someone who'd been up since 4:30. The food was served hot, fast, and with minimal questions. You could get a grilled cheese, a malted milkshake, and a side of pickles for roughly the price of a newspaper and a compliment. For many Americans, the diner became a second home, a place to refuel both your car and your soul. Long before fast food chains arrived, the diner was where you went when you needed a pancake and a moment to think about whether the tire pressure really was supposed to be that low. By the mid-20th century, the car had not just transformed travel, it had transformed daily life. People no longer walked to the corner shop. They drove to the supermarket. They didn't stroll to the bakery. They drove to the drive-thru. Roads now ran from coast to coast. Cities became wrapped in loops and exits. Families packed themselves into station wagons with luggage, sandwiches, and at least one grandparent. And somewhere between Toledo and Amarillo, a child in the back seat asked if they were there yet, and was told, for the third time, not quite. Part 9, in which airplanes are invented and then take a very long time to become comfortable. It is important to acknowledge the Wright brothers, if only briefly. In 1903, they managed to coax a small, fragile, mosquito-like contraption into the air over the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk North Carolina, using a combination of canvas, bicycle parts, wind, and politely worded encouragement. The flight lasted 12 seconds, covered 120 feet, and was considered a triumph. From there, progress in aviation was fast, in the sense that people quickly realized they could fly, and then spent the next 40 years trying to make it less terrifying. The earliest airplanes were loud, cold, and deeply suspicious of clouds. Pilots sat outside, wearing goggles, leather helmets, and the expression of someone who had made their peace with gravity. For many years, flying was something you watched other people do, usually from a safe distance, while wondering aloud if the wings should really wobble like that. By the mid-1920s and 30s, passenger planes began to appear, offering what was optimistically referred to as scheduled air service. These early commercial flights were remarkable feats of endurance, not just for the pilots, but for the passengers, who sat on wicker chairs inside a cabin that smelled faintly of oil, damp coats, and apprehension. The planes flew low, slow, and often sideways in a strong wind. The engines roared continuously. The windows rattled. The stewardess, singular, handed out chewing gum and encouragement. There were no meals, no movies, and no guarantee that you wouldn't land in the wrong city, or occasionally the right city but upside down. Still, by the 1940s, air travel had found its wings, helped along by wartime aircraft production, and a generation of pilots who logged more hours than their clocks could handle. Airlines like TWA, Pan Am, and American Airlines began connecting major cities across the country. You could now fly from New York to Chicago in just a few hours, assuming the weather cooperated, the engines didn't freeze, and the runway had been cleared of goats. Cabins became pressurized, seats were padded, windows were round, which helped with aerodynamics, and also gave passengers fewer corners to focus their anxieties on. There were now tray tables, seat belts, and, in first class, something that resembled chicken, served with something that resembled peas. It is worth noting that in the early days of commercial flight, flying was considered a formal occasion. Passengers wore suits, ties, hats, gloves, and facial expressions ranging from mild concern to polite awe. One was expected to sit upright, speak quietly, and respond to turbulence with the same dignity as one might display while being gently shaken in a cupboard. As more Americans took to the skies, airports began appearing in cities across the country. Early terminals looked like grand train stations. There were red velvet ropes, ticket counters staffed by people with excellent posture, and departure boards that clicked mechanically with a sound that suggested something very important might happen at any moment. By the 1950s and 60s, air travel had become a symbol of modern life, convenient, aspirational, and only slightly uncomfortable. Flying coast to coast was no longer a novelty. It was something you did when you had to be in Los Angeles by Wednesday and had already ruled out the train, the bus, and the possibility of simply not going at all. In-flight magazines arrived. Pillows were handed out. Cigarette smoke lingered in the aisles, mingling with the scent of reheated lasagna and mechanical ambition. Airports installed moving walkways, and passengers used them as opportunities to stand completely still while inching toward their next gate. And yet, despite the speed and efficiency of it all, air travel never quite lost its awkwardness. You still had to arrive early, wait patiently, shuffle in line, remove your shoes, and hope you weren't seated next to someone enthusiastically eating a tuna sandwich. You still had to look out the window and think, that wing seems bendier than I remember. But it worked. You could wake up in Boston and fall asleep in Phoenix, having flown over mountains, plains, cities, and at least 2 entirely unrelated weather systems. The train might have been more scenic, the car more comfortable, but the plane, for all its noise and knees in your back inconveniences, had done something extraordinary. It had made 2,000 miles seem like an afternoon. Part 10, in which we remember what it once took to to cross a continent and then check the time and realize we're already late for our connecting flight. Every now and then, in a quiet moment, usually while standing in an airport security line behind someone with 17 pockets, it is worth pausing to remember just how far American transportation has come. Once upon a time, in the not-so-distant past, a person setting out from St. Louis to reach California would load up a wooden wagon, say goodbye to everyone they knew, and hope they still had all their teeth by the time they saw the Pacific Ocean. The journey took months. There were rivers to cross, deserts to traverse, and oxen to encourage. Rain came in sideways. Supplies ran low. The trail was marked with discarded furniture, broken wheels, and the occasional journey entry that read, "Still in Nebraska." Today, one can make the same trip in a private airplane while eating almonds from a small bowl, texting a friend in New York, and softly complaining that the Wi-Fi isn't fast enough to stream a show about people baking cakes. In the 1840s, you walked beside your wagon. In the 2020s, you ride a motorized suitcase through an airport, because walking is apparently something you now delegate to your luggage. The contrast is not subtle. 100 years ago, the idea of coast-to-coast travel in a single day was fantasy. Today, people do it regularly, sometimes for a meeting that gets rescheduled after they've already boarded. We fly over the Rocky Mountains in our socks, chewing gum and checking the weather in 4 cities at once. We no longer pack food for the road. We get it delivered to the road through an app while we're sitting in traffic in a hybrid car that reverses itself. But somewhere between the wagon and the Wi-Fi, there are other stories worth mentioning. Take the Greyhound bus, the long-haul workhorse of the American road. For generations, it offered a kind of grim dignity, a place where anyone with enough patience and a seatmate who kept to their own snack bag could travel from Cleveland to Tallahassee for the price of a modest sandwich and the better part of a day. It was not fast. It was not glamorous. But it was possible. Bus terminals smelled like coffee and waiting. The seats were sticky in summer and stiff in winter. The overhead lights buzzed with the authority of a place that would never turn them off. Yet there was something democratic about it. A collection of strangers bound together by geography, cheap fares, and a shared understanding that every journey contains at least one inexplicable delay in Topeka. Compare this to the modern ride-share scooter, now cluttering the corners of nearly every American city. Light, zippy, and deeply unaware of historical context. These scooters can be activated with a phone, ridden 4 blocks to the grocery store, and left sideways against a fire hydrant with no real consequences. They represent the pinnacle of convenience, a reminder that we've come from walking for weeks to scanning a QR code for 4 minutes of mildly unbalanced motion. Meanwhile, cars, once the great symbols of freedom and risk, have become so advanced that they can now warn you when you're about to drift into another lane, park themselves, and suggest nearby Thai restaurants. You can travel from New Jersey to Oregon without reading a single road sign, thanks to a voice named Carla, who lives inside your dashboard and says things like, "Turn left in 800 feet," as though she's always known you. And yet, we still complain. We complain about legroom, about traffic, about layovers, about the fact that our gate was changed again, and now it's all the way down the other end. We complain when the train is 5 minutes late. We complain when the airplane Wi-Fi drops for 6 seconds. Somewhere, a man is currently sending an angry email about how his electric scooter didn't charge fast enough. And it's okay. Complaining is part of travel. But it's also worth remembering that not long ago, people crossed America, with nothing but leather boots, iron pots, and vague directions written on the back of a weather-beaten map. They traveled with children, chickens, hopes, and the underlying knowledge that if a wheel broke, the solution involved trees and rope and waiting for the rain to stop. How we have terminals, overpasses, flight attendants, snack carts, and multiple lanes. We have planes, trains, buses, scooters, bikes, and cars that can go from 0 to 60 faster than your grandfather could say, "Don't touch the clutch." We have apps that plan our entire route, tell us where to get gas or electricity, and occasionally remind us that we forgot to leave a review for the last person who drove us home. And still, somehow, we are always late, always rushing, always scrolling, always wondering why the gate is so far, and if the shuttle bus will come before our will to go evaporates entirely. But at least we're moving. At least, in some small way, we are still in motion. One foot, one wheel, one squeaky escalator step at a time. From the Oregon Trail to the terminal shuttle, from the river crossing to the TSA checkpoint, from the back of a mule to boarding group C. Transportation in America has never been perfect, but it has always been possible. And sometimes, every now and then, it even gets us where we're going.